I want to talk about playing the long game, so look at different multi-fertility managements for the seasons ahead. So in the baseball theme, I'm a Cubs fan, but I saw a Cardinals hat here, so I'll save that, and I will get it shut off. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Oakland Athletics instead, so he doesn't have to hear me rant about the Cubs. But the Oakland Athletics are a very historic ball club, really old, but they're more of a small market, so they don't always get the biggest prospects. They kind of have to, find, those hidden gems. And so what I really like the story, and they've got a lot of good stories. One of them is actually they made it into a movie called Moneyball, starring Brad Pitt as the Athletics general manager, Billy Beane. And if you haven't seen it, it's a really great story. Basically, they have to do more with less. And so I think we can definitely relate to that. And so he's one of the ones who started using data and statistics to really build his team. And everyone thought he was crazy, but during that season, he actually had 20 consecutive wins in 2002. And so I believe at that time, it was the record for the league they were in. But so general managers, they've got a lot of different duties, and we can kind of, relate that to some of the farmers, to some of the duties that farmers have. So some of their objectives is roster management, right? What fertilizers should we be applying? The next one is contract negotiations. What rate should we use? How many years of fertility should we apply at once? And then the next one is financial management. So when can we purchase this fertilizer to really get the best bang for our buck and really have the highest yield? So, I take these, and that makes me think of some different research questions. The first one is, what are the long-term effects of multi-year fertilizer application? Should I be applying every single year, every other year, once every 4 years? And so when should I be applying that fertilizer? And so within that, it's kind of a sub-question is, do soybeans like old fertility? Now we talked a little bit about that before, but we've really seen that soybeans tend to like older fertility. I think Dr. Sybil might explain a little bit why. But it's definitely a question that we often get. The next one is, I wanted to see if multi-year blends are more economical in a long-term system. So if fertilizer is cheap, can I dump on a bunch at once and then not have to apply the rest of the time? And maybe I'll be more economical and get more yield. Or maybe I need to apply every single year so there's more available fertility. So we set up a study, and we started it in 2021. And in Champaign, Illinois, and the site that we actually had some pretty good soil tests. So as an agronomist, I probably wouldn't recommend putting out a full rate of fertilizer. But one thing we do notice is that sulfur value is a little bit lower. So we're probably going to have to apply some sulfur. And so there's a lot of different sources of sulfur out there, but the one that we used was Poly4. So you might not have heard of it, but it's a product from Anglo American. It's not actually commercialized yet, so we get to use all the cool new fertilizers that aren't out yet. But it's got potassium, sulfur, magnesium, and calcium in it. But we're mostly focused on the potassium and the sulfur. So we used that, and we blended it with MAP, with potash, and in corn years we used urea as our nitrogen source. And so Poly4, it's a sustained release fertilizer. So it's not a slow release, but it's still available, but maybe for a longer period of time than your typical AMS or your ATS. And so we apply it to different crops. So we got 2 crops, corn and soybean. And so we're doing this broadcast in a conventional tilled system. And so for our corn, our typical recommended economical rates is 180 pounds of nitrogen, 70 pounds P2O5, 60 pounds K2O, and about 25 pounds of sulfur. That's opposed to soybean, where we're not applying, or at least we're not shooting for any nitrogen because we're relying on our nodules. 30 pounds P2O5, 60 pounds K2O, and only 15 pounds sulfur. So we got our different rates, and then we've got some different treatments. So our first one is our untreated control, where we're not applying anything for 4 years. The next one is our biennial corn-only amount. So we're applying in 2021 and in 2023 in the spring of corn years with only enough fertility for corn. We're letting soybeans scavenge up whatever the corn doesn't take up. The next one is the annual application to either crop. So we're applying this one every single year. 21, 22, 23, 24. So both crops get it. So if you do that, your application fee is actually going to be higher because usually you wouldn't apply anything to soybean. So that's something to think about. The next one is a biennial 2-crop amount. So this, we're applying it in the spring before corn with enough fertility for both corn and soybean, which is probably what the typical, what your typical strategy is now. Marcos Lohman talked about it a little earlier, and he said only, I believe, 35% of people were doing the annual application. So most people are doing that biennial 2-crop amount. And then we also have our single 4-crop amount, where we applied in the spring of 2021 before corn with enough fertility to hopefully get us through the next 4 years. And so if we look at the total applied after 4 years, notice we have 3 treatments here that have the full rates, and that corn only, remember, we're not applying anything to soybeans. So that's actually going to be a lower rate after 4 years. And so if we look back on our trial timeline, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, and we applied in the spring in 2021, which was a corn year, and that was actually a normal precipitation year. 2022 and 2023, we rotated with corn, soybean. Those were more dry years. So you remember that when we get to our results. And then we planted soybean last year in the spring, which was somewhat of a normal year, quote unquote. And so we do this, and then I want to know, can we see the value of multi-year fertilizer? Remember, we were on some high soil tests, so we didn't see as much the first 2 years. But that 3rd year is when our treatments really started to pop. If you look at that, our untreated control compared to that 4-crop amount, even in 3 years after that application, we're still seeing that effect of fertilizer. And then when we look at the 2-crop amount compared to that 4-crop amount, remember at this point in time, it's actually the same amount of fertility, just different timings of the fertility. So you can see that 2-crop amount is much bigger than that 4-crop amount. And so this tells me that fresh fertility to corn is really important for early season growth. Now remember, 2023 was a drought year, and so we saw a lot of responses, even across different trials, to fertility, probably even earlier than we would see them in other trials. So we really, some people, they get to a tough year and they want to give up on their crop. This just shows that we really need to keep managing it, and there's still something for that crop to give. Today's genetics are really impressive. And so next I want to get to the grain yield, get right to it, and we'll go year by year. So in 2021, the corn year, we had good responses overall. They weren't super high, but remember we had good inherent fertility, 4 to 8 bushels overall. But that 2-crop amount did have the highest yield, and that 4-crop, even though we're applying more fertility in this scenario, it didn't actually yield higher. So we weren't limited on these nutrients. The next year in 2022, we asked that question, do soybeans like old fertility? And here we saw that the answer is yes. Each time we applied in the previous year and didn't apply that year, we increased yield. But you see that annual treatment, that's where we actually decreased by a bushel, but about the same. And our highest yield, again, was that 2-crop amount that had the best response. 2023 corn, we had some really good yields. Remember I said it was dry. If we look at our UTC 2021 and compare it to 2023, it's the same hybrid, but we actually had higher yields. So it just shows how impressive today's hybrids are, even under drought stress conditions. But under that drought stress conditions, we actually saw a higher response to that fertilizer. 8 bushels with the corn only, 7 with the annual, 14 bushels with that 2-crop amount. Now, at this point in time, the 2-crop and the 4-crop amount have the same amount of fertility, but again, we're seeing higher yield with that fresh fertility application before corn in the spring. And then 2024 is a great year, 90 bushel beans. So we definitely hit that grand slam that Dr. Bila was talking about on our untreated control. So it was a really great year, really good variety, but every single fertilizer treatment helped us gain yield. But overall, if I'm a farmer and I want to pick one treatment, I'm picking that 2-crop amount. That had the most consistent results over every single year. We had our highest yield. So our grain yield findings are even at the adequate P and K levels, there was still a yield response to fertilizer even in that first year. So we're still seeing increased yields. The second one is fertilizer applied to corn in the dry year actually caused a greater early season response and a greater yield response. The next one is in 2022, which was a bit drier. Soybean liked the old fertility actually. 2024, that second year, we just had some excellent yield, so any fertility helped then. And then finally, the 2-crop amount overall provided the greatest yield. So, kind of just sums it up. Pretty simple trial, but we dove in a little bit deeper on maybe why this is happening, what's going on in the soil. So I'm going to go through a few different nutrients. We're going to start with our soil phosphorus test. And so we've got our ppm, and we're going to go year by year. So we're starting in the fall of 2021. We applied in the spring of each year, but we sampled before we applied. So we didn't want to get that fresh fertility in our soil samples. So in the first year, it's pretty simple. The more you apply, the higher soil test. Makes sense, right? The next spring, or the following spring, about that same trend, that 4-crop amount is still on top. The next one, we applied that annual application in the spring, and so we saw that jump a little bit higher, even above that 2-crop amount. But remember, soybeans like that older fertility so we actually saw the better response to those older fertility treatments. The next one is it's the next spring, so roughly about the same levels. And then we applied our fertilizer. And so what happened here, we applied our 2-crop amount, we applied our corn-only amount, we applied our annual amount, and that's what's really causing it to spike. You can see the natural variation of the soil too with that UTC. But that 2-crop amount is really jumping off the page there, giving us fresh fertility that we definitely need. But then, we get back to that spring, and we're, about the same level as that 4-crop amount because we have the same amount of fertility out there. And then we end up at the end of the trial in the fall of 2024. We see some differences between each treatment. And so I want to look at that a little bit closer. And on top, we have our 2-crop amount. So that's where we saw our highest yield. So it really makes sense there. The next one was our annual amount because we're applying fresh fertility every single year. It was actually even a little bit higher than that 4-crop amount when we applied it, 4 years ago. And then that corn-only amount ended up on bottom. And it was consistently on bottom, which makes sense because we're applying less fertility. So, if we're wondering, do we need to cut rates maybe a little bit? I don't think we should consistently cut rates because you're going to end up really mining your soil and you're going to be in a deficit. So this is our soil phosphorus test. We did the same thing with potassium. I'm just going to go through it real quick. Same exact story with potassium. Our 2-crop amount was the highest, and our corn-only amount was the lowest of the fertility treatments, and obviously our untreated control is on the bottom. Now we also looked at sulfur. Sulfur is pretty interesting. It's quite different than the other treatments actually. So the first year in the fall, the more you apply, the higher the soil sulfur test. Makes sense. But then in the spring of the next year, we actually saw most of our treatments fall back down to the same level of the untreated control. The only one that was different was actually that 4-crop amount, where we're applying 4 years worth of sulfur at once. And even then, it's only a little bit above that untreated control. And so the next fall, at the end of the year, our 4-crop is right at that same level as our untreated control. So it's just showing that we are sampling in the 0 to 6 inch depth, and it's just showing that it's leaching from the root zone. However, our annual application, it did spike a little bit. Remember, we had applied it in that spring, so it's fresh available fertility there. But the following spring, it was right back to the same thing. Everything was the same as the UTC. We applied that spring, and then our 2-crop amount actually went to the highest. So we applied both the corn and the soybean amount, and so we saw higher sulfur tests there. The corn only and the annual was the same amount, and so they're at the same level. But the following spring, everything is pretty close to the same. That 2-crop amount is a little bit higher, but we had more of a milder winter, so not as much leached out. So some of it was still available, but I really wouldn't count on that to be available, because at the end of the fall of 2024, everything was the same as the untreated control. So our soil nutrient findings was that our 2-crop amount resulted in the highest P and K levels, and the corn only was the lowest of the fertilized treatments. I mean, the corn only kind of makes sense. We're applying less fertility. But we also need to know mobile nutrients like sulfur need to be applied every single year. If it's a different source, maybe like elemental sulfur, that might be a little bit different story. But if it's sulfate sulfur, they need to really be applied consistently. And so I show all this, and so most farmers are really on the right page or on the right track. But we all want to relate back to economics. Which fertility management is most economic? And we don't talk a whole lot about economics in this lab, but I was just so excited that, and I wanted to relate it back to my farm, so I put some numbers to those values. So we know that fertilizer costs have, they've been really wild over the past 5-6 years. 2020 they were relatively lower, and then 2021 they really started to spike. And so we applied that 4-year fertility in 2021. So we're applying 4 years worth at the right time. And if you're applying in 2022, you're applying very expensive fertilizer. And then it kind of leveled off a little bit as we went into 2024, 2025. But so here's the 4-year fertilizer costs. So what I did is we applied it in the spring. So these costs are from the first week of April from the USDA. Obviously, there's going to change what co-op you're using and what day you do it. So, these are just some consistent values. But if I wanted to apply a 4-year amount rate at once, I would do it in 2021, which is exactly what we did for this trial. And so I want to break it out by each year. In our corn, our 2021, we planted our corn, and we're paying for that fertilizer in that year. 2022, we're only applying that annual, so we're going to have a fertilizer cost. 2023, same thing. In 2024, and so if we look at each treatment and we look at the lowest cost, obviously it's going to be the untreated control because we didn't apply. But the next one is that corn only because we have the lesser amount of fertilizer. But out of our full treatment, out of our full rate treatments, our 4-crop amount was indeed that lowest amount. So now I want to know, well, am I getting the most return on that investment overall? So then we have to look at, what did we sell our grain for? And I know we'd love to see these prices today. The more I look, the more disappointed I get, it feels like. It seems like we're going to have a really great crop, or at least it looks like from the road, and it seems like the USDA keeps backing it off a little bit. But so some pretty good prices for this. And so what I want to do is I want to relate our profit back to our untreated control. So these are just the differences from our UTC. And so you can see in 2021, we're not making money. We didn't have a whole lot of responses to that fertilizer. We had good soil. So we're in the red there. but most of those treatments, they're relying on the soybean to really help make the yield or make up for the return. So you can see 2021 corn and that 4 crop amount, that's where our highest cost is. And then after that, we're making money every single year. In 2022, fertilizer prices were pretty high. And so that soybean crop, the annual application is where we're applying that fertilizer. And so we lose a lot of money. And remember, we didn't see an increased yield with that annual application. So we're paying for the spreader to go across the field, and we're not seeing a response to that fresh fertility. We saw it better in the older fertility, and so that's where we saw some higher profit. And so out of the treatments that had that full rate, we actually saw that 2 crop amount had our least loss. Now, obviously, we don't want to see a loss, and we want to use that corn-only amount, but you have to remember what's going on in that soil. We're only applying enough for soil, and we're in a fertilizer deficit. So if we look back at our soil fertilizer tests, we're reducing that amount. 9 ppm for soil phosphorus, 19 ppm lower for our soil potassium. And so, if we look back to our profit, we need to make sure we're sustaining our soil tests. And so I really think that 2 crop amount is the proper fertilizer strategy. So in our economic analysis, using that build-up strategy and purchasing fertilizer when prices were cheapest did not result in a higher ROI. And then while the corn-only amount did have the best fertilizer profit, the P&K test fell below the levels of the others, and we weren't replacing those nutrients that we were removing. And then the 2 crop amount actually had the least losses while we were still able to maintain fertility levels, and they actually had the highest fertility levels of all the treatments at the end of the 4 years. And so the 4-year summary is the 2-year fertilization strategy really produced the greatest yields. It had the highest soil tests, and it did have a sustainable ROI. Now, we always want to make money, but if we're thinking about our soil, we want to be able to maintain it. So if you're applying fertility, we want to make sure we at least break even. Obviously, we don't want losses, but there's a lot of losses with our nutrients as well. But overall, 2-crop fertilization is the preferred method. So, and with that, I can pass it on.
Thank you very much, Sam. If you like Sam, we're going to give him a short break and then bring him back, obviously.